Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first Standards Committee of this municipal year. I'd like to hand over to our clerk, Jill Hollyoak, to read out the housekeeping notice, please.
Thank you. Please note this meeting is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. The meeting may also be recorded or streamed for live or subsequent broadcast by members of the public, although ultimate discretion in this matter lies with the Chair in case of disruption. For those in the room, please note if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the assembly point in the front car park of this building. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. For those in the room, this includes turning off microphones and turning the volume down completely on laptops. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. As this is our first meeting of this municipal year, I'd like to introduce the committee. To my left, in the green, we have Councillor Armstrong, then Councillor Maidment and Councillor Nanovo. We have on my right, Councillor Farquhar, and our monitoring officer is Ms. Jenny Berry. We have a very special guest tonight. We have Simon Gocher, who is a partner at Maidment Solicitors. Our Democratic Services, Head of Democratic Services and Deputy Monitoring Officer is Richard Jones. To the right of me here is Councillor Chapman-Law. I'm Councillor Ricketts and Jill Hollyoak, who we've already introduced. We also have with us our very wise and distinguished independent persons, Mr. Paul Cashmore and Mr. Ian Sibley, and they are joining us tonight. So welcome everybody, welcome to members of the public present and also to those watching on our live stream. We now move on to agenda item 1, please, which is apologies. Are there any apologies for this meeting? Thank you.
Apologies have been received from Councillor Eleanor Connolly and Councillor Dwayne Farr. Item 2, substitute members. Councillor George Farquhar is here for Councillor Connolly.
Lovely, thank you very much. You're very welcome to be here, George. It's nice to see you here. Agenda item 3 is election of the chair, and for this I'm going to ask my vice chair to take this item, please. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to seek nominations for chair, please. In that case, I shall.
If I may nominate Councillor Ricketts for the role of chair, if you please. Councillor George Farquhar.
And a secondary, if you please. Anybody? Thank you very much. And do we have any other nominations? Okay, that's a no then. Thank you.
So, Councillor Ricketts, you are elected as chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for putting your faith in me for a second year. I do take this role very seriously. For me, there is nothing more important than upholding the ethical governance of this council. We've got a super committee here. We're all quite experienced on this now. We haven't actually, whilst this is our first meeting, we have actually been very busy behind the scenes. We've had lots of consultation meetings, and we've got our 2 very wise independent persons, and we really respect their views when it comes to our consultation meetings and also for their input at council. So thank you everybody for your continued support. We've got a busy year, we've got a lot to do, and I look forward to working with you all. Thank you. So we move on now to agenda item 4, which is the election of the vice chair, and I'd like to seek nominations for election of the vice chair, please. Councillor Maidment.
Thank you, Councillor Ricketts. I would like to nominate Councillor Chapman-Shaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it gives me great pleasure to second that from the chair. Are there any other nominations, please? No, excellent. In that case, Councillor Chapman-Law, remain seated where you are, please.
Thank you very much.
Right. Can I ask the members of this committee, please, if they have any declarations of interest, and if so, what action they propose to take? Excellent. So there are no declarations of interest. Agenda item 6 is the minutes. Can I have a proposer and a seconder to confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 16th of April, which seems like an age ago? Thank you. Proposed by Councillor Chapman-Moore. Can I have a seconder, please? Thank you. That's seconded by Councillor Armstrong. And I will sign those minutes.
Excuse me, Chair. As a point of order, shouldn't that go to the committee for a vote?
So it should. Thank you.
I'm so sorry.
So is everybody happy with the minutes? Please, can I have a show of hands? Thank you very much. That's carried.
And if I may, Chair, I'll be abstaining on that, simply because I'm not a member of the committee, nor could I verify that I was at that particular meeting in April. Thank you. And if that can be recorded in the minutes, that would be much obliged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping us honest. We go on to agenda item 7, public issues. We've received 4 public questions from Mr. Alex McKinstry, copies of which have been circulated to members of the committee. I'd like to invite Mr. Kinstry up to the table to ask his questions, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair and Vice Chair, and congratulations. Good evening, committee. Shall I proceed with the first question?
Please do.
Okay, and these first 2 questions relate to agenda item 8, I think it is, which is the Code of Conduct Complaints Review. Item 9, I beg your pardon. Apropos of the Code of Conduct Complaints Review, correspondence relating to one complaint has been sent to me as the complainant, marked private and confidential. This complaint was being dealt with at the informal resolution stage and was upheld in part. Can you explain why such correspondence is being marked private and confidential in relation to upheld complaints when there is no requirement for this in the Constitution, given that there's a conflict here with Nolan principles, i.e. openness and accountability, and given the iniquities which this can give rise to, such as unsuitable appointments to committees, or the spectacle of councillors transgressing in public but apologising in private, which seems inimical to natural justice.
Thank you, Mr. McKinstry. The private and confidential marker was included on the decision letter template used for many years. This issue has not previously been highlighted. However, since Mr. McKinstry first raised this in response to the decision letter sent to him, this marker has been removed from all subsequent decision letters.
That's very reassuring. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, the second question then. Of the complaints received in the present municipal year, I see that 6 have been partially upheld at informal resolution stage. A number of these contain some very alarming allegations. Complaint number 180, for instance, includes allegations of bullying, misuse of council resources, compromising the impartiality of an officer, and intimidating someone involved in an investigation. Can we be told which allegations were upheld in this particular complaint? And when the Code of Conduct is reviewed, as promised in the committee's work plan, could this committee consider naming subject councillors where allegations are not only proved, but particularly egregious?
Thank you for your question and the suggestion to include within the review report details of which allegations were upheld. It would be very useful and will be included in future releases of the report. In relation to complaint BCP 180, the subject councillor was found to have breached the following obligations of the Councillor Code of Conduct, namely 1.1, to treat other councillors and members of the public with respect. 1.2, to treat local authority employees employees and representatives of partner organisations and those volunteering for the local authority with respect and respect the role they play. 2.1, not to bully any person. 3.1, not to compromise or attempt to compromise the impartiality of anyone who works for or on behalf of the local authority. And 8.3, not to intimidate or attempt to intimidate any person who is likely to be involved with the administration of any investigation or proceedings. As detailed within the committee's work programme on agenda item 13, the committee is seeking to review the Code of Conduct complaints procedure, and as part of the issues as to whether or not details should be placed in the public domain will be considered.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And the final two questions both relate to item 14, which is the consideration of reports into complaints 160, 169 and 171, which date back 8 to 11 months. Can we be told when the investigator was engaged in each of these complaints and when the completed reports were received? Can we also be told how much the council was charged for each report and whether those sums were inclusive or exclusive of VAT? The VAT number for Waitman's LLP, if it helps at all, is GB 974825769.
Thank you. The complaints referred to were referred for investigation during April 2024, following an initial review by the Chair, committee members and the independent persons. It was necessary to seek additional supporting information from some of the respective complainants. The final reports were received by the monitoring officer on the 20th of August 2024. The total cost charged, exclusive of VAT, because as a council we can claim that back, in respect of each complaint referred to is as follows. BCP 160, £1,949. BCP 169, £2,442. BCP 171, £1,827.50. That makes a total of £6,218.50.
That's what I make it as well. That's fine. And the very last question of all, once the committee has considered those three complaints, 160, 169 and 171 this evening, almost certainly in exempt session, will the public be readmitted to the meeting and the live stream resumed so that the committee's findings might immediately be made public?
Thank you, Mr. McKinstry. Yes, I can confirm that the committee will return to public session to give its determination.
Thank you very much indeed.
That concludes public issues. So we move on to agenda item 8, the annual report on the Code of Conduct complaints. This provides a summary of the complaints received and determined which were made against councillors for alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct. The committee has a duty to consider an annual report and to promote and maintain high standards of conduct. I will now ask the monitoring officer and deputy monitoring officer to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to introduce this item for you. So if I can just refer members to pages 11 to 16 on the agenda of item 8. The annual report provides an update on a number of issues, namely the details of the independent persons, the existing arrangements and procedures for handling complaints, the process for updating the register of interests, and a summary of the complaints determined in 2023-24 with historic data for the previous 3 years. If I can just refer to a couple of these issues, I'm not going to go through in detail in the report, but in relation to the independent persons, we currently have 2 independent persons, which you introduced at the beginning, Chair. We did have 3, but Jonathan Story resigned as an independent person earlier this year. The IPs provide an essential element to our review process and are engaged, as you've again alluded to, during the consultation meetings and relevant committees. And I'm sure you join me in expressing our thanks to the independents and indeed Jonathan for his support over the years. It will, as a result, be necessary for us to recruit an additional independent person. We will need to start that process in the coming months to get us back up to the 3 IPs. In relation to the complaints data, I must just clarify that this is the data for 23-24 and includes only those complaints that were determined between the period 1st of April 23 and the 31st of March 2024. The number of complaints, as I've highlighted in the report, are actually relatively low for 23-24, partly due to the elections. We had elections in obviously May 2023. We had a large cohort of new councillors learning the ropes and so on. So the numbers for 23-24 are naturally lower. But as you know, we have had quite a significant increase in the number of complaints received during the latter part of 2023-24. They don't form part of this data because they were determined or still pending in 24-25. Due to the low number, the analysis is actually a little bit more limiting this year. But as in previous years, it does remain the case that the written word by email, social media remains the most likely source of complaints, with a lack of respect being the most common alleged breach, and that is consistent with previous years. There were 3 potential breaches found in favour of the complainants during that year, and on each of those occasions, the subject member did not comply, and they formed part of a non-compliance report, went to full council, and the remaining cases were all dismissed with no breach. Clearly the numbers were low. However, dealing with complaints are an extremely resource intensive process. The number of complaints that we've received in the latter part of the year and in this year are high, relatively high. And I think we just need to bear in mind that it is every councillor's responsibility to uphold the ethical governance and the good ethical behaviour, and be conscious of the impact that has on resources. Clearly any complaint is an expression of dissatisfaction, and wherever possible we should try to avoid it and reduce complaints. There is a separate report on the work programme for the process, as again you've already alluded to, in terms of the process for handling complaints, which we'll no doubt discuss later on. The report's really for information, unless there's any other actions you are arising from that should go in the forward plan. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Members, are there any questions that you wish to ask of the Deputy Monitoring Officer on this report? Yes, Councillor Farquhar.
Yes, do please excuse me, Chair, if I don't get the terminology right. Where the Deputy Monitoring Officer was giving the report, they made mention to a failure to comply report going to Council. I believe I was at that meeting, and I believe there was some misunderstanding as the nature of how that report is delivered to full council. May I just check that future reports of that nature going to council will be reported correctly as per the standing orders and the outside? What I'm trying to get to the point of is that the councillors were not named in that chamber, nor were they invited at that time to offer an apology in lieu of not submitting to the sanctions laid down by the Standards Committee. I do apologise if I don't have the right terminology.
No, you're quite right. That was disappointing. They were named in the report, but they weren't named in the chamber. This has been discussed, and that will not happen again. We will be naming people.
I very much appreciate that, because it is an additional sanction, or shall we say, an encouragement to comply as per the declaration that all councillors make when they sign up to take up public life, is that they will comply with any direction or recommendation from the Standards Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and failure to comply with the sanctions of Standards Committee is in itself a breach of the Code of Conduct. And with our relatively now new monitoring officer, this is something that we are all very keen to ensure does come about at council, so that we can be seen to have some more teeth, I think is the expression. Does anybody else have an, oh, sorry, monitoring officer, thank you.
So, Chair, if I may, I'm hopeful that going forward, we will be able to create a much more detailed annual report. This focuses on a review of the complaints that we've received. However, when you look at the detailed issues that we could address at item 13 on the forward plan, I'm hopeful that going forward we'll have a much more rounded annual report with a view to that going to full council to be shared. It will sit alongside the annual report from the Audit and Governance Committee and also form an integral part of evidence for the preparation of the annual governance statement. So with the committee's indulgence, we would like to sort of remain alive to a much more rounded, more detailed annual report being formulated. And perhaps we could build in an annual report on the forward plan when we get to item 13. So it doesn't just concentrate on complaints, but it looks at the whole of the ethical governance framework that this committee is custodian of, if that was acceptable, Chair.
Very much so. I think, yes, certainly, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I want to acknowledge you, Jamie, for pulling this report together. It's really helpful and interesting, I think, to see it all in black and white, as it were. With regards to point 25, the summary of financial implications, I'm wondering if going forward, if we can actually provide evidence to members about the costs of investigating complaints, and also with regards to the number of investigations that have needed to be carried out. I think it would be really useful. And I think something else, there is another issue that we've discussed on previous committees with regards to publishing decision notices. And I think that would be good practice for us to get into that as a habit, to also sort of to give ourselves a bit more teeth as well. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. And this is the kind of thing that we're going to be looking for when we do our review of our code of conduct and how we are going to go about reporting this, because we want to make sure that members are fully aware of not just the financial cost of investigating these complaints. It's our officer time. It's the time that we put into this as well with our informal consultation meetings. It's a big piece of work. And it is quite onerous, especially when you look back at, years when we've had, 57 complaints from the public, 61 complaints in 22-23. That amount of work, we shouldn't be having that, because members should know not to breach the code of conduct or to behave in such ways that it could invite members of the public to consider that they've breached the code of conduct. Obviously, people are often found not to be in breach of the code of conduct, and that has to be taken into consideration. But there is a financial cost, and I think it needs to be reported certainly to council so that members become aware of that. Thank you for that suggestion. Are there any other questions to the monitoring officer or deputy monitoring officer at this time?
Just in support of Councillor Armstrong, sorry, I've got a bit of name blindness. Councillor Armstrong's suggestion, I'm so pleased to hear that you're taking that on board. I think just by hearing public issues tonight and hearing those costs of the employment of an investigator, from myself speaking as a councillor, it's one of the things which I would be conscious of in my behaviour to the deputy monitoring officer's suggestion for training, particularly around social media and emails to members of the public, is that we could well incur that cost if we are not conscious of the code of conduct when we're replying to members of the public or we're conducting ourselves on social media, because that is a cost incurred. But there's a very valid point. And perhaps we could go a stage further to actually document or put a value on the amount of officer time and committee time that's spent on each one of these ones that goes the full distance, due to perhaps a breach that could have been avoided by, for want of a better term, better behaviour and more conscious behaviour of that particular councillor that the complaint is directed towards.
Thank you, Councillor Farquhar. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think that, you know, the conversations that we've had around this in our consultation meetings, social media being the bane of this committee. I think it's certainly training is essential, and continual training. And we have some of the sanctions that we have stated have been that, you know, the councillors must have social media training. It's so easy to get caught up in a discussion, and I know it's not, you know, a lot of the time it's not intended, but I know that Mr. Gocher is going to be touching on that in his presentation to us tonight as well, and I hope that that presentation will also then be made available to all members to see, because I think it's quite valuable to see how we are perceived when we are acting as a councillor, when we are not. Those are the big questions that come out of the complaints that we have received on social media. Any other comments? Any other debate on this item? Okay, we have a recommendation, which is to review the annual report on the Code of Conduct and identify any areas for further work to be included in the work programme. And I think that we've identified some of those issues tonight. So from the chair, I propose that we accept the report and extend our thanks to the monitoring officer and deputy monitoring officer, not only for the report, but for the work that they put in dealing with these complaints throughout the year. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Chapman-Law. All those in favour? Excellent, that's unanimous. Thank you very much. We now move on to agenda item number 9, Code of Conduct complaints, the review. This is an update on concluded complaints and outstanding unresolved complaints since last reported to the committee in April. And again, I'm going to ask our monitoring officer and deputy monitoring officer to introduce the report, please. Thank you.
I'll just introduce it very, very briefly. Thank you, Chair. I just want to highlight this is a very lengthy report, but I just want to set some ground rules on that. We haven't had a meeting this municipal year, and therefore the report is longer than you would ordinarily anticipate. In summary, there are 25 live complaints at this moment in time. 6 of those were withdrawn, so it is a very high level of complaints that we're dealing with. We've provided a summary. We've also acted on previous guidance from the committee and included dates, for example, as well. So hopefully we've provided sufficient information. Clearly, Chair, if members wanted more deep dive into any of these complaints, I would have to advise you that we may have to go into exempt session, partly because some of these are not closed yet, they're still pending, and don't want to frustrate any investigatory work that is ongoing in terms of trying to get to some of those complaints to a conclusion. But I just wanted to set the caveat that it is so long because this is your first meeting of the municipal year, Chair.
Thank you. It's quite shocking, isn't it? But we have this number of complaints already this year. Well, we know how busy we've been in our consultation meetings and dealing with this, and then you start to see it laid out like this, and it actually makes you realise exactly how busy we've been, and how busy you've been with all the ones that are pending still as well. Members, are there any questions to the monitoring officer? Sorry, Mr. Jones, did you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Just again before you open up for debate, again following on from the monitoring officer as well. I should stress as well, this is actually a snapshot, so things are constantly moving. So this is as it was when we published the agenda. There would be changes, which I'm not going to go through at this point, but it is supposed to be intended as a very much as a snapshot. Again, in response, the monitoring officer has referred to the fact that we now include the date of the received and the determination date. I must stress the received date is the date that we received the initial complaint. And it may be something we want to discuss moving forward in terms of your arrangements. However, sometimes we do need to go back to complainants and ask them for additional information. So it's not necessarily the start that we can process that complaint. It is the date it is technically triggered in that sense. So there is sometimes a delay at that very initial stage. Again, I just wanted to highlight that in response to the question that we had, we will in future include where we uphold a complaint, details of those categories that are found to have been potentially breached on that. And I just wanted to talk about the second section. So the table in paragraph 8 is all the detail of those complaints, but just draw your attention to really some action that we're asking or determination that we're looking for you to make in relation to complaints that are stalling, if I can put it that way, at this stage. And they are complaints BCP 170 and BCP 176. They're in paragraphs 12 to 17. In each of these complaints, the subject councillor has refused to comply with your request for remedial action. So they failed to comply. And the report sets out a series of options for you to consider. As officers, we probably recommend that in order to move these forward, they are a non-compliance report to council, naming those individual councillors. And in relation to 177, which is paragraphs 18 to 21, this is where we have asked, again, it says in the report, we've asked the subject councillor to furnish the monitoring officer and yourself, Chair, with additional information. That hasn't been fruitful at this point, but rather than a non-determination or a non-compliance issue at this point, the recommendation from officers is that's referred back to you as Chair, your members and the independent persons to consider those next stages before bringing it back to the committee.
Thank you. I think that seems like a very sensible way forward. Can I ask, I'd actually, before I ask members, I'd like to bring the independent persons in on this and ask for your thoughts, and if you have any questions on this report, please. Mr. Sibley.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to, I have no questions on the report or on anything so far, but I would like to second the appreciation that we have for the work put in on this huge task of all these complaints, both by the Deputy Monitoring Officer and the Monitoring Officer, and indeed all their staff. Thank you, Jill, for your contribution. That's all I wanted to say, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cashmore.
Yeah, I'd like to, a couple of things. I'd like to second what Ian has just said. Just to remind you as well, Chair, that ever since I first came on this committee, I've been all for more publicity about naming the councillors and naming the costs that are incurred, especially by non-compliance.
Thank you, Mr. Cashmore. Yes, we've discussed this quite a lot, haven't we? So yeah, it will be good to see this coming forward in this way. So members, are there any questions or any debate? Any statements? Yes, Mr. Chapman. Sir Chapman.
177. We're waiting for extra information from the person. That the date on here says 3rd of June. Was that was when the request was made? I'm just wondering how much time we give them.
Through you, Chair, that there's been a number of email exchanges, to be fair, since your initial determination of that complaint. So it probably was back in June. But I think it is right that you make that next determination before it comes back to this committee to consider those, because you haven't seen all of that pitch, you haven't seen the exchange of emails and that information that has been provided to date. So I don't think it would be appropriate to probably refer that directly onto council at this stage, which is why we're recommending it goes back first of all, and then perhaps it may need to come back to committee and then on to council in due course.
Thank you. Yes, I do think that seems a fair and reasonable way to go about this, because I think it's worthwhile us seeing those email exchanges as to whether there has been good reason, and then we can make a decision on that when we consider that in our consultation meetings. Any other comments? No? Okay, so the first recommendation is to note the outcome of concluded complaints and the progress of those still outstanding. And I'm happy to propose that from the chair. I'd like to deal with the second part separately, just so that there's no confusion. Can I have a seconder for that part of the recommendation, please? Thank you, Councillor Maidman. All those in favour? And that's unanimous. The second part, for clarification, is to determine which of the options referred to in the report should be pursued in relation to the unsolved complaints identified in paragraphs 12 to 23. The recommendation from the officer is that complaints 170 and 176 be reported to council as non-compliance, and that complaint 177 comes back to an informal consultation meeting in the first instance for further deliberation. And again, I'm happy to propose that from the chair if I have a seconder, please. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Chapman-Law. Is there any dissent? Are we all in agreement? Yeah. Days, that's unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you, members. Thank you, independent persons, and thank you, officers. And we now come on to agenda item 10, which is guidance to councillors and officers who are appointed to outside bodies. This is an opportunity to note the guidance which was considered by Cabinet on the 2nd of October and will be recommended to Council on the 15th of October for inclusion in the Constitution. And I'm going to ask the monitoring officer to introduce this, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for accepting this report on your agenda. I accept it's not ordinarily a report that you would see, but as a monitoring officer, I feel that this is an ethical governance guidance that has been drafted primarily to support the council's management of its shareholder responsibility. So it is an accompanying report to that cabinet discussion, and it will come to council on the 15th of October. On review of the constitution, I felt that there was a gap in our ethical governance guidance to councillors and officers who are appointed to outside bodies. It doesn't have to be a council-owned company. It could be the school governors, it could be a trust, a charity, whatever it is that you may come across, either as an officer or a councillor as part of your councillor responsibilities. Therefore, put together this guidance which helps cover perhaps those questions that you would like to ask but don't know who to ask. And it also gives you some encouragement that if someone asks you to sign a document when you join something, please don't, unless you get approval of that document to sign it by my legal services team or myself. So it's kind of just supporting guidance. I thought it was important to bring here because it does just touch on conflicts of interest. It touches on issues of when you have indemnity and exposure to liability for some of the decisions, and it just fulfills the wider perspective of your role as a councillor. I'm asking for you to note this report as you are the custodians of ethical governance. Obviously, you can make comment on this in full council on the 15th of October if you so wish, but I felt that it was just for information purposes. I'm happy to take any questions on this either in the meeting tonight or outside of the meeting, whichever members prefer. My recommendation to council on the 15th is that this will be included in part 6 of the Constitution and will sit alongside our current documents, which is the Code of Conduct, the Officer Member Protocol, and planning guidance and associated other protocols that we have supporting members in various aspects of their democratic life. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Monitoring Officer. It's a very comprehensive report, and I think it's brilliant. And I really do appreciate that you are finding these little gaps and are bringing these things forward. And I know that we've spoken about, sort of the reviews of other documents that we feel need to be considered by this committee going forward in our work programme. And it's very refreshing to have that assurance of the I's being dotted and the T's being crossed, and our ethical governance being robust. So thank you for your work in this. Members, are there any questions or any comments on this document for the monitoring officer, please? Councillor Chapman.
George.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Farquhar, sorry.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I very much welcome this. When I was first appointed as a director, and then when I was unappointed as a director, this document would have been extremely useful for me. Can I just seek confirmation of a couple of things and to understand the document itself, which I haven't read fully? Is that the first one is that I take it that this document, the plan, is to share it with the member before appointment to a body. The second one is that an opt-out option. There are some roles for outside bodies which are in the gift of the leader of the council to assign. But it's not necessarily that every portfolio holder would want to take up that particular role, or for the sake of political balance, that they wish to do so. So, without having read the entire document, is there an opportunity for a try before you buy, e.g. to read what the responsibilities are as a director, or, you know, to sit on an outside body as part of that decision-making process, to actually say, it's not for me? And I draw on my own personal experience here, being appointed as a director by a previous leader of the council, and then being, what's the term? Forced to resign by another leader of the council, in that I had a great degree of moral or ethical consideration to take up the role of a director with an outside body, even though it was a wholly owned for outside body. And I think there should be an opt-out clause to actually for people to look at this, because the responsibility of a governor or a trustee or a director is actually quite a heady responsibility, and people might not be at the right point in their life's journey or their well-being to actually take that role up. So I'd kind of like a little bit of clarification for how this document will actually be applied in reality for those that are appointed to outside bodies in the future.
Through you, Chair. Thank you for the comments. In respect of does it give the gift of being able to opt out? No, it's not as explicit as that, but it should enable all members to make an informed choice about whether they accept the offer of taking up an appointment or not. My concerns prior to drafting this was that members weren't informed, didn't have this material available in order to make that informed choice. Very much when you're appointed to an outside body, you do take on separate risks which are not attached to the council, and it can be, in extreme circumstances, it can be a great personal liability and a personal risk depending on what document you sign. But I'm hoping it moves into allowing officers and members to make informed choices. My proposal, subject to, I don't want to preempt the decision of council, but if council supports this document going into the council's constitution, I hope to have it uploaded to the members portal so that it's permanently accessible without having to trawl through the constitution. The constitution is getting quite chunky. It can be quite a minefield to navigate, but if you're looking for something and you're having a memory block on what it is that you're looking for, so I'm hoping that it could be uploaded to the members portal site and learning site, that we will keep it up to date. Obviously, there's a lot of legislation quoted in this as well, so it will keep under review, and it may be something that this committee also wants to review as well, in terms of preempting the forward plan discussion, but whether you feel this should form part of member training, and it may form part of that toolkit for mandatory member training, just so that members are fully informed. I should also say that accompanying this as well, any officer or member appointed to, for example, a council-owned company will also be offered quite a significant package of training as well. We do need to look at that. It's quite onerous, especially if you're appointed to a director role, and it's important that you are trained so that you know the appropriate questions to ask. So, because it is expected that you sit on as a director on a board with the sufficient education, knowledge, and confidence in order to make informed decisions which are in the best interests of both the council, but more importantly of that board, of that company, and you understand the role and purpose of it. So yes, it's lengthy. it comes with a lot more onerous responsibilities, such as the training as well, and that will be bespoke depending on what you're appointed to. And I do need to speak to colleagues as well about whether we offer training around appointment to school governorships or anything like that, because I'm not familiar with that, because I'm still a bit too new to find out the whole wealth of training. But it's something that Richard and I can pick up as part of the members portal and part of your forward plan as well, Chair.
Excellent, thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Farquhar, did you want to come back on that one?
No, the monitoring officer identified a shortfall in that sort of full information of actually taking up that role. I know that particularly for new councillors, it can be quite a roller coaster ride, and they may actually put their hand up in eagerness for something which they didn't quite anticipate would be the end result of putting their hand up in the first place. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sorry if I use the terminology as an opt-out. I think actually being informed at the point of offer to say, here is a link, sleep on it, read it, sleep on it again, and then say yay or nay. I think that's and the value add of having that training for those that perhaps don't have the confidence, perhaps fulfilling a role as a director for the first time, is immensely appreciated, because that's part of public life, which I certainly didn't have any indication that would be required of me when I put myself up for election the first time.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Maidment.
Yeah, I just want to say I really welcome this. I still find the whole idea of us as a council owning other businesses and the directorships and how those interact with each other kind of a complete and utter minefield. So I think the fact that we're making some real kind of clarity in terms of giving us a real basis for decision making and the accompanying, hopefully the accompanying training to go along with that, I think it is really, yeah, it's a really positive step forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I go to the independent persons? Do you have any comments to make on this report, please?
This is Paul. Yeah, just supportive of the comments that were made in the report.
Thank you, Mr. Cashmore. Mr. Sibley?
No comment, Chair.
Thank you. Anything further from our members? No, in that case, the recommendation is to note the report proposed and that the proposed guidance, Appendix 1 of the report, be considered by Council on the 15th of October. So I have a proposer, please, rather than coming from the chair all the time. Thank you. Councillor Farquhar, Councillor Chapman-Law, that's lovely. All those in favour? Unanimous, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Monitoring Officer. And I think item 11 is over to you as well. Monitoring Officer, that's dispensations granted by the Monitoring Officer. This is a report advising on the dispensations granted between the 1st of April and the 30th of September. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is my outstanding item report, which notifies you of the retrospective dispensations which have been granted since I last reported to you. As you can see, the report is quite self-explanatory at paragraphs 1 and 2. So we did grant dispensations for the meeting of council on the 23rd of July and a second dispensation of the same meeting to enable full and frank debate around a housing motion. If I may, Chair, I'm conscious that our council on the 15th of October there will be a debate, I anticipate, on the community governance review. I just wanted to advise you that I'm minded to grant a dispensation to all BCP councillors to enable a full open debate, because it infects local democracy right at the very root cause of democracy, and I'm conscious that a lot of our members are dual-hatted in terms of parish or town councillors already, and it's important that they have a say as well in sharing their experiences. So I just wanted to advise you that that is currently what I'm minded to do, and I'm open to any views that the committee might have, because I'm in a unique position of being able to share that with you prior to a meeting happening rather than retrospectively reporting. But likewise, if you're happy to support the granting of a dispensation, I'd welcome that as an additional recommendation, Chair.
Thank you. For my part, it seems eminently sensible I'm aware of a number of dual hatters, especially sort of in Christchurch where I am. We have a number of parish councils, and we've also got a number of proposed neighbourhood plans going on, and I'm sure that members would welcome the mass dispensation for that. Are there any questions on this going forward? Independent persons, any questions on this? All quiet on the independent person
I have
front?
sorry, Chair. Again, I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Yeah, nor me. Thank you.
Very much. So the recommendation is to note the dispensations, and then we have this additional recommendation, which is to support the monitoring officer's dispensation to all members when considering the governance review at council meeting next week. Do I have a proposal for that, please, proposer? Thank you. Councillor Chapman-Law, seconder, please. Councillor Maidment, all those in favour? Lovely, that's unanimous. Thank you very much. So now we have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Simon Gocher from Wakeman Solicitors, who's going to make a presentation with some slides which have been circulated to the committee and will be published on the website after. Welcome, Mr. Gocher. It's lovely to see you here, and please carry on with your presentation.
Thank you. I was just going to share the slides for the benefit of everybody. There we go. It's always a relief when that works. Thank you very much for inviting me along this evening. As you've heard, I'm Simon Gocher. I'm a partner in Wakeman Solicitors. I'm the head of the local government team at Wakeman's. We're a national law firm, and we do a lot of public sector work and a lot of work for local authorities. I've been in that role now for 11.5 years, but prior to that, I worked in local government for nearly 20 years, including most recently as a monitoring officer myself. And a significant amount of my work is in advising local authorities and monitoring officers on standards issues, carrying out standards investigations, advising standards committees, and doing training on member conduct. So I have a fairly good sort of overview across the country of some of the issues that local authorities and members are facing in relation to code of conduct issues and complaints. And I think, as you've heard this evening, the use of social media is quite a common issue which gives rise to complaints to local authorities and monitoring officers. And there are a number of issues, I think, that particularly can be problematic, and why social media is such a fruitful source of complaints against members. Some of which is to do with the medium and the way it operates, and elected members are no different to any other people who sometimes can find themselves in the spotlight by use of social media, because it's instantaneous and sometimes it's difficult to deliver nuance in a short number of characters. So part of that is just a symptom of the medium and the way we now operate as a society. Some of it is to do with the structural nature of the way that code of conduct works, particular issues which I think cause some difficulties for members and for people who are making complaints, is when members are acting in their capacity as such, and also where you balance a member's right to freedom of speech against another person's right not to be disrespected, and where that balance sits and how that operates in the context of the code of conduct. So I particularly tried to focus on the legal provisions and guidance in relation to those issues in what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. And I think it's important to really look at this issue, because social media is such an effective means for councillors to engage with their communities and get messages out to large groups of people quickly. So what I want to stress is this is in no way about stopping members from doing that. It's recognised it's a really important and useful tool for you. And it's also a useful tool for councils and other organisations. But that comes with the caveat that there are numerous examples of councillors and other politicians who found themselves criticised for what they've posted on social media, and there have been complaints which have been upheld, and there have obviously been some very high profile issues of members and other people in the public glare who've got themselves into significant difficulties with the way they've used social media. There are relevant parts of the code which could apply in relation to the way that you use social media and where complaints could arise. The main ones you heard that you're likely to get potential complaints are is respect and allegations that in things that are posted on social media, you as a member have failed to show respect to the public or to other councillors. There's also the provisions around bullying and harassment and equalities. Again, you may find yourself subject to complaints that the way that you've used social media could breach some of those provisions of your code as well. Bringing the authority into disrepute is another one that often gets cited in complaints which relate to a member's use of social media. So those are the potential provisions which are most likely to be engaged where there's a complaint about the way that a member is used or posted on social media. One of the first things that has to be considered, though, is the code of conduct only applies to you when you're acting in your capacity as a councillor. And I think social media is the biggest potential grey area where there could be a dispute as to whether or not a member is actually acting in their capacity as a councillor when they are engaged in that activity. Sometimes it's obvious whether a member's acting as a member. Whatever you say in this meeting this evening, obviously you're saying in your capacity as a member. But then when you leave the room, but you're in the corridor outside, are you still acting as a member? When you've got out of the front door and you've put your coat on, are you still acting as a member? And this is some of the things that the case law has looked at. And in relation to social media, it's even more problematic, I think, than things that happen in physical real life. Your code obviously says that it applies to all communication and interaction when you're acting as a councillor, and that is absolutely right. So as long as you are acting as a councillor, whatever you do in that capacity, whether it's acting on social media or not, it falls within the code. And this is derived from the legislation, the 2011 Localism Act, which obviously in England is the governing legislation for the way that member conduct operates. And it specifically says that every relevant authority has to adopt a code of conduct which applies to members and co-opted members when they are acting in that capacity. And there have been some cases before the courts where that has been considered. A lot of those were in the pre-Localism Act regime, which some of you may be familiar with. But nevertheless, the sorts of decisions that were made then are still relevant to the law today. It hasn't changed in that respect. Case you may well be familiar with, it's the most famous one, involved the Mayor of London at the time, who was found not to be acting in his capacity as the Mayor of London when he was effectively doorstepped by a journalist when leaving a function. And a significant element of that decision was the fact that he had, although he was at a function he was attending in his official capacity, he got up, he left, he put his coat on, he was outside of the door. And so those sort of principles can be cross applied to other sorts of activities, including the use of social media. Again, on the other side, another case which was heard in the courts was where a councillor who'd made a video of himself trespassing on land, referring to himself as a councillor and saying that he was making planning inquiries in relation to planning issues on that piece of land. In that case, he sought to argue that he wasn't acting in his capacity as a councillor, but the court disagreed and said the fact that you're referring to yourself as a councillor, saying that you're dealing with planning issues, means that it brought their activities within the code. So we've got the benefit now of some LGA guidance, which has been introduced to supplement the model code of conduct, which they issued some time ago. And I think that's quite helpful in terms of trying to explain where the lines are drawn with social media, because it can be quite difficult and it can be blurred because members may use their social media across obviously the various different formats that there are to post things about their personal lives or their interests or their political lives, but they may also include activities in relation to the council and about council business, and that can be where there's then a concern for the public as to, well, are you acting as a councillor or aren't you? And that's where the lines can become a little bit blurred. What the LGA guidance says, which is absolutely right in accordance with the law, is that simply describing yourself as a councillor in a social media posting or at the top of your page or in your username or profile does not mean that everything you post on that social media is covered by the code. The term councillor is a title that you're entitled to use, and it doesn't mean just because you use that everything you are doing when you use that title falls within your capacity as a councillor. There must be some link between what you are posting about and local authority business or your role as a councillor, and that's, I think, the important thing to be aware of and think about. Nevertheless, clearly, if you are describing yourself as a councillor and you've got that in your bio and you are on X or Twitter, for example, you are posting things on one post about a council meeting. I was in the Standards Committee tonight and I heard this presentation, and then the next one is about, and then I went home and I went and watched something on TV and it was really interesting. Sometimes the members of the public will then think, well, actually, this is a councillor site, a councillor activity, and link the two. So some councillors, to help them avoid this, have found it useful to have separate social media profiles, one which they use for personal use and one that they use as for official council business. You're not required to do that, but sometimes that can help, because then you are clearly differentiating between, you know, a Facebook profile which is just for family and friends and one which you use for council business and to engage with your constituents. Again, a sensible rule of thumb, which I think sometimes the nature of social media means that people, and not just councillors, treat what they post online as something different to what they would say to someone's face, you know, the keyboard warrior phraseology. And I think it is a helpful rule of thumb to think, well, if I'm replying to a comment, and you might be replying to a comment which has been critical of you or a decision that you've made, if they were in front of me at a meeting, would I say this and should I say this? And sometimes the sort of should I count to 10 and think about this before I post this is another good piece of advice. The LGA guidance is quite helpful because it provides some specific examples to sort of help illustrate this, which I think, you know, bringing things to life makes it easier to think about how it might be applied to the way that you engage with social media. And so it gives some examples where a local councillor was found to be acting in their capacity. And this was a one where they said that a local authority officer should be sacked for failing to put adequate arrangements in place to clear the snow. Even though it wasn't posted on a local authority page and he didn't explicitly describe himself as a councillor, he was found to have breached the code by treating that officer with disrespect and seeking to put undue pressure on officers. So it's really about the content rather than how you describe yourself and whether it links to council business or council activity. The converse of that, a councillor who described himself as such in his Twitter profile but made insulting and offensive comments about the Prime Minister, leading to complaints, was found not to have breached the code, as comments didn't directly relate to his role as a councillor or local authority business, but was seen as wider political comments. Can be, again, where sometimes particularly members of the public find it difficult to differentiate between your personal capacity, your personal views, maybe your political views as a member of a particular political party and commenting on another one, and then your role as a councillor. And there are three distinct areas, but they can become blurred, and you, particularly the last two, the political and the councillor role, can become merged over, and that's something that you need to be aware of and think about. Some examples that I've put there, which I think hopefully might help, is you've got a mythical councillor Smith posting about football. I was at the game last night. I've been a season ticket holder for 20 years and never seen such an abject performance. I'm not saying that I wrote these slides after my team had lost at the weekend, but that may have had something to do with it. I certainly would never post things like the manager wants shooting and the goalkeeper should be strung up. I'm not that type of football supporter, but those are the sorts of things you do see on Twitter, and you see a lot worse sometimes. But that wouldn't be the Councillor Smith acting as a councillor. even if he's got his name, his Twitter account, there is nothing there that links to council business, nothing there that would be saying that he was posting that in his capacity as a councillor. He's doing it as a frustrated football fan, albeit one that I would suggest shouldn't be posting that sort of thing. Contrast this with a very similar post, but one that says, I will be moving a motion at the next council meeting that we no longer support this rabble and we remove funding from them, and then making similar comments does, in my view, then bring it within his capacity as a councillor, because he's saying, I'm going to do something as a councillor about this, and therefore it would be considered to be acting in his capacity as such. So virtually the same, but because the first one has no reference to anything to do with the council, it's not in his capacity. The second one, in my view, would be, because he brings that into it. So that's official capacity. One thing I would say is there is a recognition, I think, that that can be difficult for councillors and members of the public, to the extent that when the Committee for Standards in Public Life did a review of member conduct in local authorities a few years ago, they did suggest that the government could consider bringing in a presumption that councillors, when they are posting on social media, are doing so in their official capacity. But that would require a change in the law, which hasn't been put into effect. So at the moment, we're left with the legal position as I've outlined. But there is a recognition that that can sometimes cause difficulties. I think that change in the law, you know, some people will agree with it, others won't, was intended to really create more certainty. But obviously the flip side of that is members are entitled to their own private lives and their own private opinions. And I think some people feel that will be going too far and infringing on that. So that shows some of the balances you have to think about when you're looking at these sorts of regimes. The next issue, which is something I think which again has to be considered wherever there's any complaint about something that a member said on social media, is balancing their rights of freedom of expression under under English law generally, but particularly under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, against other people's rights not to be disrespected by them. And that's something which, certainly when I'm investigating complaints, I have to consider with pretty much everyone around social media, and is one that standards committees, when they're considering these issues, have to consider. And there have been some cases where the Ombudsman has criticised local authorities where they haven't properly considered the interaction between freedom of expression and code of conduct issues. So I've set out what Article 10 actually says there. I won't read it out for you, but I think the important thing is that it's not an unfettered right of freedom of expression. There's a lot of talk around freedom of speech, ironically on social media. A lot of it doesn't really seem to understand what the law says. It's not an unfettered right. You can't just say anything you want about anything. It's balanced against the rights and freedoms of others. And there are certain things, for example, if you defame somebody, they will have a right to sue you for that and potentially get damages if it's found that you have defamed them. So it is always a balance between the rights of the person making the comments on the one hand and the rights of people affected by them on the other. Political expression particularly receives enhanced protection, though, under Article 10. And there's a whole load of case law around that, which I won't bore you with. But I think, and this predates the European Convention on Human Rights, it's always been recognised in English law that you know, it's a very important aspect of public life that we can have a full and frank political debate. And I'm sorry to say for you that politicians have to expect a certain degree of criticism and challenge for the decisions that they make. I think the other thing to recognise is that doesn't just protect the, you know, what is said, but the way it's said as well. So a degree of immoderate, offensive, shocking, disturbing, exaggerated, provocative, polemical, colourful, emotive, non-rational and aggressive language that wouldn't be accepted outside of political debate is tolerated. But again, there's a line, and a lot of this is about, well, where do you draw the line in terms of going too far? But I think it's recognised that certainly politicians can criticise other politicians. To an extent, they can also criticise officers engaged in work for public authorities, albeit there's a sort of sliding scale. So you've got politicians, I'm afraid, have to expect have to tolerate the highest degree of potential criticism. Then senior officers, but more junior officers, don't have to put up with necessarily such amount of criticism, and that's what has to be applied when you're looking at potential comments. I'm not going to sort of go into detail about these cases. You can have the slides anyway, but there are a few cases which have looked at the comments of members, not all of them on social media. This one's quite an old one where it was in good old style, sort of handwritten comments on a letter, and then the then leader of Peterborough Council actually went on the BBC and gave comments which were considered to be and were offensive to people in Carrickfergus in Ireland, which it related to unexplained deaths of army personnel, and they'd written to him or the council seeking some support in that, and he'd sent it back with a handwritten note saying members of the armed forces do get killed, be it accident by design, that's what they get paid for. There then ensued an exchange about it, and Councillor Sanders made those additional comments there, which were unsurprisingly considered to be offensive by those it was about. He was found to have breached the code of conduct. At that time, the sanctions in place were more significant than they are now, so he was actually disqualified from being a member for a period of time. He challenged that in the courts, and the judge said that his comments were not political expression and were not protected by Article 10 because they were little more than an expression of personal anger, his time being wasted. So not everything that a politician says is protected as political opinion. It does have to be about political issues. The next case is a Welsh one, but for this purpose, the law is the same. This was a community council, which is what in Wales parish and town councils are called, where a councillor wrote quite a critical blog about his fellow councillors and the staff at the council. He was found to have breached the code, but appealed that to the High Court. And the court upheld the challenge, saying actually politicians in their public capacity should possess a thicker skin and greater tolerance than ordinary members of the public. But again, it comes down to what he says. These, in a sense, were more mild criticisms than you might get in other cases. So it'll always be balanced in terms of whether it's a politician talking about another politician and how far you can go before the code is engaged and you're found to have breached the code. This one is a Post-Localism Act case, and it involved a councillor in Ealing who made some comments there about the local community in Southall, which he was particularly critical of. Unsurprisingly, members of that community found it quite offensive. It referenced the fact that they were largely of Indian origin, and he was found to have breached the code, and again brought a claim in the court saying that his speech was protected by Article 10, and the court, unsurprisingly in my view, rejected that, saying that they were an unjustified personal and generic attack on a section of the public. They weren't politicians that he was criticising, or it wasn't political speech at all. They were just ordinary members of the public, and therefore he had breached the code. The final case I was going to mention is another Welsh one. This was a councillor in Flintshire who was extremely critical of a number of senior officers of the council that he was a member of, and he was found to have breached the code. He again tried to rely on the fact they were political comments. He was criticising council members, a council and council officers, therefore he should be entitled to do that. But the court said no. One of the reasons was he actually made statements which were untrue and he didn't believe to be true. The other thing was basically the breaches were so serious, the comments he made were so serious, had such a serious effect on the officers that he commented on, that even with the greater protection afforded to politicians, it's still justified of finding a breach of the code. And again, because the sanctions in Wales are more significant than the ones in England, he was disqualified from being a councillor for a period of time. Although I believe after that disqualification ended, he was elected back to become a councillor again. So what do we take on this? There is a high threshold of protection for political expression, and that applies to local, not just national politics. So it applies to parish and town councillors, borough councillors, as well as the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition. It can also apply to people who aren't politicians if they're engaging in debates on the public interest. So, there is a degree of protection for people to go out and say things on issues of, and I'm sure there will be countless local issues of debate which are referred to quite frequently. But there is a line to be drawn. Mere abuse is not political expression, although you can be flowery and polemic. Just merely going out and abusing people is not political expression. And if you make comments that you know not to be true, you're not protected. But if you honestly believe they are, you will be. So there's quite a lot in that, and it again, it comes down to application in each individual case, because every case is slightly different. I think what I would take from that, if I was a member, was there's a degree of protection out there. I shouldn't be afraid, but I also shouldn't be going out and being abusive to people. Political debate should be constructive. I appreciate sometimes that's difficult because not all of the people who want to debate with you will be constructive, and you are entitled to protection. But I think you shouldn't be fearful of the use of social media, but there are some resources out there that can help you. I think the LGA guidance, both on the code, which I've quoted from, is quite helpful. They've also got a guide on the use of social media and how to engage with it. And I'm sure you will have people within the council as well who can assist you with that in terms of some of the do's and don'ts, because it is quite easy. Probably because I'm a bit of an old Luddite, I don't use social media very much, but part of the reason I don't is because I don't want to get sort of involved in an engagement with things, with the sort of work I do. You know, we are all very easily Googleable and searchable. So, you know, I appreciate it's different for me. I'm not a politician. I don't need to engage with my community, but I think just the do's and don'ts of think twice. Would you say this to a person's face? Should I say this in a different way? How do I use this effectively and constructively to get across my point, but without ending up in a sort of back and forth and a ping pong, which could end up with me saying something I might regret. So that was what I wanted to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about all of that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Goach. That's a very interesting presentation. And I have to say that the LGA guidance is a document that we constantly refer to in our consultation meetings. We're always bringing that up, looking for help and assistance with that. And we do find it very, very useful. And I think that we would all very much welcome changes to primary legislation to beef up the sanctions to similar sanctions that Wales see, or even those that back in my day, pre-Localism Act under the old Standards Board for England, when we could really have some teeth. Members, do you have any comments, any questions on the presentation? Councillor Maidment.
I mean, firstly, I just want to thank you. That's really, really useful and really helpful. I was just wondering, is there any case law, or have the courts given any view on their opinion of where people are using or hiding behind monikers or other accounts? Because I'm not particularly on social media a great deal, but I'm very aware that there's a number of cases that have come up where people are using a kind of an account that's not associated with their name to make comments that could be seen as breaching some of these kind of articles and codes of conduct. So how would that be viewed if it comes to light, I guess, is one of the things I was kind of wondering about.
Yeah, I don't think there are any reported cases on it. I think one of the other issues with actually the Standards Board, as was Standards for England, used to produce a sort of case digest, which was really helpful in terms of cases that were happening. And they used to be, because of the sanctions previously, there was a tribunal. So now we only get case law if there's a judicial review challenge to the High Court. So there's been very few on standards. There've been a few, but none of them have dealt with that issue. I think there have been some, local cases and investigations. I think one of the issues is it's usually quite difficult to prove. I think there was an investigation recently where it was proved that a member had done that and they were found to have breached the code and a sanction was applied. So I think it would depend on the case. I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because they will may sort of argue, well, I'm not even using my councillor name, so how can I be acting as a councillor? But if it's actually talking about council business and council issues and doing it in a way which is in breach of the code, then I think the likelihood is they would be in breach of the code and they would be found to be acting in their capacity as a councillor, because it's the subject matter of what they're talking about, not the title that they use, which is the important question.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I was just, part of me was just wondering if it would be seen as being kind of a more serious breach by virtue of the fact that they were trying to hide behind something. Because I think in this day and age, I think it's one of my concerns is certainly what we see about people who use other names and spew some pretty nasty stuff, really.
Yeah, I think one of the issues, as was mentioned, is the sanctions under the code conduct regime are pretty limited. But I think that's right. I think it would be seen as an aggravating factor if they were not only doing it in a way that was disrespectful, but they weren't actually, they were hiding who they were.
Thank you. Members, any other comments, questions? Councillor Farquhar.
Yes, I think very useful, and we can certainly understand the why the or might be perceived by the public as the big bucks being spent on investigations external to this committee are actually paid, because it's very useful to see that sort of case law. And sadly, we're not going to see that case law with the nature of the way things are just now. But it certainly makes me reflect on my own behaviour with my social media, particularly with those examples that are given there. And perhaps that component part of those examples in future member training might be very useful, simply because it makes me reflect on the way that I've conducted myself on social media, to the better, I hope. But simply because you see examples of that pause, that take time out, sleep on it if necessary. But it is easy to fall into the trap of, ping pong back and forth, I think was the phrase that was used, Chair. And then lose sight of actually why are you in that discussion at all? And at some point, you need those mechanisms where you can say, well, all the best. And end that conversation. But very useful, and perhaps there is a use for those particular examples in our ongoing member training.
Yes, I completely agree. When I used to deliver code of conduct training, one of the things I always used to say was never ever use social media if you've got a drink in your hand as well, because that's, I think, when we can see some very iffy comments being made. Yeah, and that whole, I mean, you never send an email if it's a cardboard email, you sleep on that as well. It's always best to err on the side of caution, reread, think again, put yourself in a position of in standards committee. What would standards committee think? Could go back to the Nolan principles. It's so important all the time, just to reread, look at it from somebody else's perspective. Can I ask if the independent persons have any comments on this, please?
Or may I come in? I just wanted to say that we, for some years, have been a member of various standards committees, and I do sense now that there's a bit of a relaxation because of case law in dealing with miscellaneous allegations stemming from abuse, if you like, of social media. So that's been a very interesting part of this evening's presentation, and I do totally agree that perhaps members would appreciate form of this in some kind of training program.
Thank you, Mr. Sibley. Yes, I think it's very important that we try to integrate this in some form of training for social media for members. I think that we can all do with a refresher. It's always nice to have something like this, especially it's those elements of when we're not acting as a councillor as well, that we struggle with sometimes when we're doing our consultation meetings, when we're reviewing those cases, which is why we do refer to the LGA. But I'm very grateful to Mr. Gocher for coming tonight. Mr. Cashmore, please.
I think we should adopt the Wales approach to people that have that don't take account of the deliberations of this committee. Yeah, it was very helpful in determining whether somebody's breached the code. Yeah, very helpful.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, Wales, they do have it a bit harder over there for their councillors. Any other comments before we draw this item to a close? Yes, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. That was really useful and interesting presentation. So thank you for that. I think what struck me particularly is actually just looking at some of those scenarios and thinking, you know, how is the law being applied in that sense? How's the code of conduct being applied in that situation? And I wonder whether as part of the training that might be useful for councillors to actually have some scenarios placed before them and for them to assess, oh, has that person breached the code in that situation or have they not? And perhaps to make it a bit more of an interactive kind of discussion about it.
Thank you. Yes, and I mean the LGA guidance does include some of those scenarios as well, and some of those are actually picked from the LGA guidance. So I'm very sad. I always know it off by heart now. I also think it would be handy perhaps if we had scenarios like those on our website for members of the public to understand when you're acting as a councillor and when you're not, so that they can also understand that councillors are entitled to have an opinion. And I think maybe some examples that you use there might be worthwhile putting onto our complaints page, so that members of the public understand that there are two sides to this as well. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. If it's okay with members, we'll move on now to item number 13, which is our forward plan. And this is to note, but also if there's any other items that members think that we should be looking at. I mean, we have our complaints update, a review of gifts and hospitality, review of the register of interest, review of the officer member protocol, review of the code of conduct complaints procedure, and review of mandatory training, including code of conduct training. Yep.
Chair, if I may just add to this, because this is not a long enough list, is it really? So we've already debated whether we should add to this the annual report, which would need to go onto our work plan and timetable that into a future meeting. I was wondering as well, in linking in with mandatory training, Richard and I were speaking earlier about whether this committee should review the induction programme. So mandatory training is separate to the induction programme. We've got elections in 2027. Yes, Richard's nodding, 2027, and it will be here before we know it. And so therefore looking at the induction programme and learning from, for example, presentations like this evening might be helpful. I was also wondering, depending on the debate at council on the 15th, the community governance review, if that goes forward, I don't want to preempt any decision. It does mean that the standards committee will have a need for a much greater dialogue with parish and town councils. I know we already have a town council and a number of parish councils in Christchurch, but in my experience, our communication with them is quite minimal. And I'm just wondering whether we should just debate what is the communication strategy? Should community governance review transpire? What is the role that standards committee wants to have? Because we will be effectively the custodian of their ethical governance framework in terms of the code of conduct and managing complaints. So I think it's important that we do consider that. And I would suggest that that is done subject to the views of council after the 7th of October 2025, because the findings of the community governance review will be at the October 2025 meeting, because there's a 12-month statutory time frame for that. So I'm just suggesting those for additional consideration, Chair. Oh, I should also say, sorry, I think the challenge back to the meeting as well, to the committee members, is do you require additional meetings? Do you meet 4 times a year? But it's whether you feel that you need to consider scheduling an additional meeting or not. I'll leave that with you, Chair.
Thank you. are members content to add the items as set out by the monitoring officer to the work plan? Yeah, okay. One thing that I think that with regard to additional meetings, I would really like to expedite the complaints procedure, the review of the complaints procedure, so that we can have more teeth in this. And I think that in order to do that, we probably need to have an extraordinary meeting of this committee just to review that, just to get that pushed forward as much as possible. I think that with regard to the other items, I'm happy for those at the moment to be considered as we're going forward throughout the year. But one thing that we might want to consider is the order that we review them. I think that we owe it to our officers to review the officer member protocol as soon as possible, just to ensure that that is completely fit for purpose and covers everything that we feel it should. And the other ones we can do as we go. But I think it's worthwhile having that additional meeting so that we can get the procedure review done properly. Yeah.
Agreed.
Is everybody happy with that? Yeah. Thank you. So everybody, for members watching, people watching, everybody is nodding. So yeah, we're happy with that. Thank you, Janie. Independent members, do you have any comments on this, please?
Not from me, no.
Not from me, Chair, but I do accept your suggestion that the priority should be the looking at the relationship, the continuing relationship, the future relationship between members and officers. That's me with my old personnel manager's hat on.
Thank you. Yes, I'm concerned with that because that, you know, if we're having allegations of bullying or things like that, I think we've got to really consider that going forward. So thank you for that. We'll now move on to agenda item 14, which is consideration of a report in respect of code of conduct. The report provides committee with the conclusions of the investigation following a complaint made about a councillor of BCP Council under reference BCP 160, BCP 169 and BCP 171. The investigators' reports are attached as exempt appendices at agenda item 16, and the committee will be asked to consider excluding the press and public when discussing these. And I hand over now to the monitoring officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. In accordance with the Council's procedure in managing complaints, the 3 investigation reports have been brought to the committee this evening for final determination. These reports are in draft. I've set out in the public covering report the issues which are alleged to have been breached by the subject councillor, highlighted that they've been for investigation and provided you with the draft outcomes of the investigation to be determined by yourselves this evening. There are 3 complaints set out before you. I've taken the liberty of setting out in respect of each complaint the nature of the complaints that you're concerned about. The options that committee does have available is you're welcome to debate the reports. We do have the investigator in attendance this evening, and members are at liberty to ask questions of the investigator this evening in coming to a determination. You may feel that there are gaps in the report that you seek further information, and so your options are to accept the findings or seek additional clarification on any points. Given the content of the reports and that they are draft, I would ask that the committee does consider in debating these reports with the exclusion of the press and public this evening. And as you've already indicated, the committee would revert back to the public meeting to give your final determination on each report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So with that, members, we'll go to item 15, which is the exclusion of the press and public. The committee is asked to consider the following resolution, that under section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting for the following items of business on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2 in part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act, and that the public interest in withholding the information outweighs such interest in disclosing the information. And I'm happy to propose that from the chair. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Chapman Law. All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. McKinstry. I do have to ask you to leave the meeting. Thank you and welcome back to Standards Committee. We have now received the report in respect of the Code of Conduct complaints BCP 160, 169 and 171 and the findings as set out in the public report. Members, the recommendation for all three of these complaints as set out under A, B and C is that the findings of the independent investigator that the subject councillor did not breach the council's code of conduct is accepted and no further action be taken. Because this is the same recommendation for each of these, I feel that we should take each one in turn, just in case there is any dissent on this. So if we go to BCP 160, can I have a proposer that is accepted, that recommendation? Thank you. So that's Councillor Nanovo, Councillor Maidment. All those in favour? That's unanimous. BCP 169, the councillor did not breach the council's code of conduct. Again, proposer and seconder, please. Thank you, Councillor Armstrong. I'm happy to second that one. All those in favour? Thank you, and that's unanimous. And then BCP 171, again, that the subject councillor did not breach the council's code of conduct. Can I have a proposer for that one, please? Thank you, Councillor Nanovo. Thank you, Councillor Maidment. All those in favour? And that's unanimous as well. Thank you very much. That brings this committee meeting to a close. I'd like to thank our officers. I'd like to thank our investigator. I'd like to thank our member of the public and also our independent persons for their wise counsel as always. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much indeed.